Hello everyone, it's Melissa Sweet here, public health journalist from Croaky, and I'm very pleased and honoured to be sitting here with Professor Ngiare Brown. We're sitting in Parliament House and we've just had the launch of the 20-year report from Bringing Them Home, making recommendations for governments to finally act on the needs of the stolen generations. Professor Brown, can you tell us a little bit about your work and how it intersects with the stories we've been hearing this morning?
Good morning. Lovely to see you. So look, at the moment I run a not-for-profit with some of my colleagues that I've managed to rope into some broader mischief. We're focused on child and adolescent wellbeing for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander munchkins, and particularly working with children affected by trauma and with complex comorbidities. And so therefore the overlap is, day by day and week by week, we're uncovering, a broader range of evidence that demonstrates that adverse experiences, particularly in childhood, can actually shape you across your life trajectory. So everything from, the architecture of your brain through to how you then express that in your health, in your mental health, in your well-being, in your ability to engage in education, your ability to build and maintain positive interpersonal relationships, your ability to engage in the economy, to be employed, to be economically independent. They're all related to the kinds of environments within which we raise our children, how we nurture them, how we know how to nurture them as role models and as parents.
And how is it through providing clinical services that you're doing that work, or how do you actually, stop trauma affecting children?
So and that's always a big call, isn't it? So, there are far greater, smarter, more attractive people than me that have been working on this for quite some time. So, we've just taken the perspective that, we just need to do what we hope we're good at, and an area that we're very passionate about. And part of it, yes, is clinical outreach to community-based services. That includes Aboriginal community controlled services, but also schools and other community organisations. And we provide interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary teams. So primary care providers, clinical psychologists, paediatricians, paed psychiatrists, for example. And we provide some of the assessment and some of the care planning from a clinical but also from a cultural perspective, and help bring the threads together. Many of our communities, we're finding, they have multiple agencies and service providers. It's not an uncommon story to hear that there are 50, 60, 65, 70 different service providers in town, NGOs, government providers, state or territory run, for example. But not often enough do they connect, do they draw the threads together. And so we're helping to be able to provide some of that complex case management, stir the possum a bit, and see how we can focus our efforts on children, child-focused, trauma-informed care for assessment, and then planning for their well-being over time. And that includes, the space of preventing violence against children, which is something very close to my heart, right through to how we then deal with the repair, rehabilitation and the healing of munchkins affected by adverse events, trauma and violence. But also then we know that irrespective of what we do for kids, we need to also provide some focus on all of those, those ecological layers. So parents, carers, schools, community environments, and provide some capacity development around that as well.
What geographic areas are you working in?
So at the moment in the ACT, in far north New South Wales, and we've been invited, because we only go to communities where we've been invited, in far north Queensland and possibly in the northern parts of South Australia.
And how does your work tie into what we've been hearing about today regarding the ongoing suffering and trauma of the stolen generations?
Well, we're now, like I mentioned, we have a growing body of biomedical evidence that supports what we have always known intuitively as peoples, Aboriginal, non-Aboriginal, that if we are exposed to traumatic events, to violence, if there's unresolved grief and trauma in the life of an individual, that is not just their own story. That narrative affects everybody that is interconnected to them. So their children, their families, their communities. And if it is unrecognised in particular, a lot of mob don't even realise what they're feeling and experiencing. Perhaps was it from, their grandmothers or their mothers, environment, but it affects them physically, physiologically, and also psychologically. And if you just want to get your nerd on for a moment, another thing I'm super excited by is the epigenetic evidence. And so, exposure to certain, let's call them toxins, for example, some will mutate your cells and your DNA. With epigenetics, it doesn't mutate per se, but it does turn on or off certain expressions. So, that can be intergenerationally transmitted. So who's to say then? And Helen Milroy tells this beautiful story, and she was saying, I don't believe in research, and I'm not very good at research. And she said, but I was thinking the other day, if your grandmother, as a woman, this is a woman's talk, your grandmother, when she was pregnant with your mother, that also meant that she had all of the ingredients for you. So that is literally 3 generations within a single vessel. So who's to say that what she was exposed to, your grandmother, at that particular time, hasn't also then affected you 2 generations later? That's epigenetics, ladies and gentlemen, but from a really culturally powerful perspective. We are now catching up on the science that actually tells us that is absolutely correct. And so that, I think, from a the science research evidence perspective, would support, again, what we've always known. And there's big studies in the States, the Adverse Childhood Events Survey, for example, and there's also the Watches study that was done in WA that also demonstrated that children of families of parents and grandparents that were removed as children have far worse outcomes across all of the social determinants of health and wellbeing.
So today the report is making a series of recommendations calling for governments, particularly the federal government, to provide some leadership and actually action funding addressing issues like intergenerational trauma, more research, more understanding of the needs of stolen generations. What's your comment on those recommendations, or how would you like to see the federal government respond?
So I'd just like to say that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples are providing leadership. So let's see our parliamentarians, our politicians and all of the departments match that kind of leadership, because obviously, and whether you talk about bipartisan or multi-partisan perspectives, we need to be all working together as one on this. Otherwise we will never overcome those intergenerational cycles of disparity. So there's that. And it's I'm very interested in that space between the evidence. So yes, research, build the evidence, but then of course we need to be able to translate and implement. So in that part of that spectrum, what does it look like from a policy perspective? What is appropriate and rational and completely doable, mind you? And the implementation, so resourcing determinations, service provision that are place-based and trauma-informed, and for me, are child-centric.
Thank you very much. Is there anything finally you'd like to add, or shall we call it a wrap?
Oh, I think I've gibbered on long enough. Thank you, darling.
Thank you for your time. Bye now.